Here's Ben Shapiro to complain that Indigenous Peoples Day is stealing the thunder of Columbus Day.
Well, today marks Columbus Day, or as it has newly been touted by now the Biden administration and by many major cities around the country, Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's worth examining in a little bit of detail how Columbus Day has morphed into Indigenous Peoples Day. Because this really, I think, may have been the first step in the United States toward the dissolution of sort of national monuments. What I mean by that is that there are monuments that had been argued over for a long time because they honestly ought to be super controversial. So, for example, Confederate monuments. You understand exactly why people would look at that and go, why exactly is there a statue of a person who rebelled against the United States?
I will give Ben credit for not sharing the hypocrisy of a lot of other conservatives who will say that liberals hate America, but will rally around these memorials to traitors. These kinds of folks often also don't seem to see the irony of chanting USA, USA, and America first while waving the rebel flag, a symbol of sedition against America.
And you understand the countervailing argument, which is that we have to actually recognize the ugliness of our history in order for us to move forward, and tearing down those statues is a mistake, that obliterating history in any of its forms is generally a mistake. That's the position of Condoleezza Rice.
Taking down statues that are meant as a celebration of a historical figure who doesn't really deserve it is not obliterating history. Obliterating history is banning schools from teaching the less savory things that the Founding Fathers did because it's allegedly critical race theory.
Okay, and then on the other end of the spectrum, statues that should not be torn down, you have statues of George Washington, which over the last few years have been hit with red paint. You've seen statues of George Washington torn down. You've seen actual American heroes being obliterated.
How does that constitute anyone being obliterated? What do you think obliterated even means?
Okay, well, when you look at Christopher Columbus, which has now become sort of a hot topic, when you look at Christopher Columbus, which is he closer to? George Washington or a Confederate monument? Right? Is he closer to a person who did something truly kind of amazing and heroic, but participated in the evils that were very common to his time? Or is he someone who's predominantly characterized by his evils? So for most of American history, the answer was pretty obviously the former.
But his greatest evils are a consequence of the truly kind of amazing thing that he did. That taints the whole undertaking.
And Christopher Columbus did something unbelievably heroic, right? He did more than any of us have done. He got on a boat. He crossed a giant ocean that had not been mapped, and he proceeded to find Hispaniola on behalf of the West, right? He found Cuba on behalf of he landed in the Bahamas on behalf of the West. And this was considered a pretty damned brave thing. He had to go to multiple different countries in order to find funding for his voyage. He had to somehow withstand mutinous sailors who got about 3/4 of the way there, and they were like, we are in the middle of nowhere. Would you like to turn around now?
We should build monuments to those mutineers. Imagine how many lives would have been saved had they been successful. Also, what exactly is the logic here? If someone does something that had catastrophic consequences, they should still get some kind of congratulation because it was hard to do? That reasoning seems a little odd to me. Also, what exactly does it mean to find these places on behalf of the West? Why is that a good thing? That makes it sound like the Americas exist for the benefit of the West, which is the attitude that led to the worst consequences of what Columbus and those who followed him did. Columbus made the trip for money. He did it for the money that he got from feudal tyrants who wished to increase their wealth and power. That, in effect, is what on behalf of the West means.
Benjamin Harrison was the president of the United States when Columbus Day was declared an official federal holiday in 1892. And he wrote a proclamation encouraging Americans to mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. He said, on that day, let the people, so far as possible, cease from toil and devote themselves to such exercises as may best express honor to the discoverer and their appreciation of the great achievements of the 4 completed centuries of American life. Right? It was the discovery that was being celebrated, not Columbus's treatment of the natives. The discovery.
Then it would have made more sense to call it Discovery Day, although even that would imply that it hadn't already been discovered. What is distinctly different about what Columbus did was not that he discovered anything. Of course, the folks who came to the Americas from Asia were the ones who actually discovered it, and Leif Erikson was the first Westerner to reach it when he got to what we now call Newfoundland. What was unique about what Columbus did was he opened the floodgates of colonialism. Yes, Columbus Day celebrates that discovery rather than the treatment of the indigenous population, but the treatment of the indigenous population was a direct consequence of that discovery. Can you not see why that might make some folks hesitant to celebrate it?
Now, the reason, again, this is important is because when we look at history, we have to look at what made the person different, not what made the person the same as all the other people who were doing evil things at the time.
Well, what made Columbus unique also had uniquely atrocious consequences. The Taino culture, the indigenous culture on the island of Hispaniola, for example, is now entirely extinct on that island, and it's debated whether there are any traces of it left anywhere. Now, you may say that this wasn't Columbus's intent, but even if you see the worst consequences of what Columbus did to be a big oopsie, that taints the whole enterprise and makes the whole undertaking unworthy of celebration, in my view.
Okay, so over the past couple of decades particularly, there has been the rise of something called Indigenous Peoples Day, which is a celebration of the people who were here before Columbus. Now, I have no problem with a day celebrating the culture and achievements of people who were here before Columbus. But to put it on Columbus Day is very specifically political.
If by political you mean the purpose is to make a point, I agree. But I also think it's a point worth making. Namely, that point is that even if you think Columbus did something good, to have a day celebrating that alone glosses over a lot of horrible stuff that ought not be forgotten. To have Indigenous Peoples Day on Columbus Day is precisely to remind people of that history. It's ironic that advocates of Indigenous Peoples Day are accused of trying to erase history when the whole point of what they are doing is to remind people of more history.
In fact, if you wanted to have an Indigenous Peoples Day and you wanted to have it coincide with, for example, an American holiday, the better holiday to do that on would probably be Thanksgiving, considering that Thanksgiving is a day when Native American peoples actually helped the new European settlers on the continent. I mean, this is why when you were growing up, the way that this was celebrated, Thanksgiving in school, is some of the kids would dress up as Squanto and some of the kids would dress up as pilgrims, and they'd all have lunch together.
Which also ignores a lot of significant aspects of the history of the interactions between the Pilgrims and the indigenous population. Ben sounds like he thinks that only the few times when indigenous folks and settlers got along are worthy of pointing out and memorializing.
And if you want to celebrate the contributions of indigenous peoples, typically you don't do that on the day that is dedicated to the discovery of the Americas by the West, right? If you want to have an Indigenous people, the only reason to have Indigenous Peoples Day on Columbus Day is to specifically hone in on the supposedly unique evils of Christopher Columbus or of the West discovering the Americas.
There aren't many calamities that closely compare to the scale of the consequences of Columbus and the conquistadors he enabled.
It's a zero-sum game when you decide to place Indigenous Peoples Day on the same day as Columbus Day. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. You could have Columbus Day celebrating Columbus, and then you could have Indigenous Peoples Day celebrating Indigenous peoples. They don't have to occupy the same day, but there is a reason they occupy the same day. And the reason they occupy the same day is because of an attempt to twist American history into a long procession of abuses and evils, unending even until today.
Simply acknowledging the evils is not twisting anything.
I would say a lot of the roots of Indigenous Peoples Day lie in the historian Howard Zinn. For those of us who are following the debate over critical race theory and the teaching of history in the schools, the truth is that critical race theory being taught in the schools is sort of the second wave of radicalism being taught in the schools, the sort of Howard Zinn version of American history, where America is indubitably bad, top to bottom.
Howard Zinn didn't teach that America is indubitably bad from top to bottom. His most famous work is called The People's History of the United States. He called it this to call attention to the struggles of, and effects upon, the people, the folks Ben would probably consider to be at the bottom, as opposed to the elites and their institutions.
In recent decades, Native Americans and other groups have protested the celebration of an event that resulted in the colonization of the Americas, the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, and the deaths of millions from murder and disease. Okay, so number one, to pretend that colonization between tribes didn't exist before the West got here, or that the slave trade didn't exist before the West got here. And there wasn't an official transatlantic slave trade, obviously, but there was certainly a ringing and robust trade of slaves, or at least slavery happening, enslavement of captives happening routinely across the Americas before the West ever got here. The deaths of millions from murder and disease, right, is what they say. Millions of people died from murder and disease in the Americas long before Christopher Columbus ever set foot on Hispaniola.
I don't think we have good reason to believe that the Taino, the folks on Hispaniola when Columbus arrived, completely wiped out the culture that lived on that island prior to their own arrival, if there even was any culture there before they arrived. But that's what European colonists did to the Taino of Hispaniola. However, let's say that the Taino did, hypothetically, wipe out some culture that existed on that island before their arrival. The idea that we shouldn't judge European colonists for doing the same because everyone was doing it to everyone else at the time is a tu quoque fallacy.
Right? It's being treated as a zero-sum game. So for the White House to sort of embrace the zero-sum game is indicative of just how deeply rooted this ideology is. And I want to get deeper into what the ideology means in a second. Here's Jen Psaki saying that it's very important to this White House to commemorate Indigenous Peoples Day, not as sort of a generalized thank you to Native Americans for their contributions to the United States and also for their contributions to world history, but instead to do it directly on Columbus Day.
The point of Indigenous Peoples Day is not just, perhaps not even primarily, to celebrate Indigenous people. It is to memorialize what they've been through. In that sense, it's more like the Jewish holiday of Tisha B'Av. It is, at least in part, a day of mourning. It seems like Ben would like it to be a day of celebration alone, because he doesn't seem to think that there's anything for Indigenous people to mourn, or he doesn't want any attention called to the uglier parts of the story lest they paint American history in a negative light. That would be a zero-sum game, in his view. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.